Okay, I can take from there, yeah. Thanks a lot for coming. Right, we're in business. So what have you guys been doing since I last saw you? I've been lying in a bed with a bad flu. So keep a 5-meter parameter if you don't want to catch flu. But my apologies. So I'm starting with what I should have done last week. Excuse me. Obviously we are 1 week behind. I'll catch up sometime in the course of this semester. Bad news is I might have to actually use up that reading week to catch up. You know the week that you guys go skiing? That one? We might have to use that to catch up on the missed lecture. I mean, the real problem in the college is that the lecture theatres are booked hour to hour, as you know, which means it's difficult to find a slot which will suit all you guys and also suit the college. So what I do, if something like this happens, is to slot it in, like this time reading week, or, bad and even worse news, late evening, which I'm sure you wouldn't want to do, would you? Your clubbing will get affected. Right, okay, so, by the way, you know that the rule is I've got to start 5 minutes past the hour and end the lecture 5 minutes before the hour. Yeah, you know that, so I'm not late. Because apparently people have got to change lecture rooms. Therefore, we've got to start at 5 minutes past and end 5 minutes before the lecture hour. Right, so what I'm going to do today is to try and explain to you what all 4 modules are in finance, the Law of International Finance modules, explain what they are, explain what we're trying to achieve with them, explain how we're going to teach them, explain to you what is the purpose of doing this stuff, and finally, to try and tell you something about the background to the law that you're going to be looking at. I'm not going to get into serious law this week because I suspect you haven't yet registered, so therefore I don't really want to do the law, find half the class gone and a new class coming in by next week. So what I will do, however, is to get to hard law, as I call it, next week. And this week is going to be to try and get you to understand what it is you're going to do at these lectures and seminars, okay? So, let's start. Oh, that's a good start. It's not even moving. Right. Oh dear. This is not a good sign. Let's see what happens now. Okay. Okay. What are these courses about? Well, as the name implies, what we're going to be looking at is the law which affects, controls transactions in the global financial markets. Transactions which are effected by global investment banks like Goldman Sachs or transnational banks like Deutsche Bank, together with multinational corporations like ExxonMobil or Mizuho, and also by sovereign states and state corporations. So that's the kind of broad parameters of the transactional players whose transactions we will look at during these courses. Now, what I'm going to do, and I want to make this very clear, we're not going to be looking at financing. We're not going to be looking at economics. We're going to be lawyers. We're looking at the law as it affects these transactions. So what we're going to look at in these modules is how are the transactions which are structured financially by the Goldman Sachs or the ExxonMobils, how do we structure them as a legal matter? What legal framework do we give them? What legal perspectives do we need to add into this transaction? We need to look also at what is the legal regime that affects these transactions because they are, by definition, multi-jurisdictional. And as lawyers, you will know that means more than one law system is going to hit these transactions. So we will, excuse me, look at the legal framework, the legal structures that are used for these transactions. We will look at the documentation that is used by the global law firms to give effect to these transactions, and we will also look at the actual processes in the global market to effect these transactions. So it's that approach that we will take. Now, I keep saying global financial market. What the heck is the global financial market? You notice I didn't use the word international markets, I used the global markets. Because the reason is because the global market is a single market. And it's a fundamental concept that you're going to work with throughout these modules. It's a single market. It's not a collection of what happens in Germany, what happens in Japan, what happens in New York, and what happens in London. No. This is a single integrated market with a number of locations, with a twin hub at the center, basically New York and London, with a number of equally important centers such as Tokyo and Hong Kong and Singapore, Toronto, Frankfurt, Zurich, Shanghai, many other major centers, but all part of this global market. Not splinters, but part of. That will give you a rough feel for what these centers are like, where they are. They are ranked every year by a group of experts drawn from the banks, and there are your ratings. Not that they're terribly important, but I thought just to give you a flavor. By the way, that's the 2017 rating, which is not here. I hasten to add, New York has overtaken London for this year. So here we go. Nothing important. What I need to tell you next is what is the coverage of the modules that I'm going to be talking in at the lectures. There's a whole number of things I'm going to cover in the 3 modules. I'm just going to walk you through them, and then we'll look at them in some detail later on during this lecture, okay? 2 basics, the 2 big transactional basics, international syndicated loans and international bond issues. They're both in LOIF 1, Law of International Finance 1. We also cover something called medium-term notes, international commercial paper issues, also in LOIF 1. Equity convertibles and warrants in LOIF 1. Now, I know this is going to sound like gobbledygook to you right now, and the answer is so it should be. But the purpose of doing this module is to understand the gobbledygook and be able to operate as a lawyer when you come off this course. But for the moment, I'm just going to give you the jargon, okay, and I'll explain it to you as we go along. Global depository receipts, which is a method, again, of raising finance in the global markets, but using shares and equities rather than debt securities like bonds. Next, we will look at derivatives, which, as you know, is a huge segment of the market, both in terms of swaps, options, a whole range of these things which we will talk about, but that will be in LOIF 3 for those of you who are doing it. Now, international project finance, you'll notice there's a big question mark on it because I'm not quite sure whether we are going to be running it this year. Lack of marking capacity. We're trying to get someone to come in and help out. If he comes in or she comes in, we'd be able to run it. I will know within the next few weeks whether it's running or not. That goes for sovereign loans as well. Securitizations is the next topic, which is covered in LOIF 3, which is about raising finance by bundling assets, dumping them into special purpose vehicle companies, and raising finance through those special purpose vehicle companies. Again, don't worry about the gobbledygook. You'll understand it shortly. Now, alongside that, in relation to all of these transactions, we're going to have to look at the regulation, legal regulation of the international capital markets or the global capital markets under US laws, the most important, EU laws, UK laws, and of course, the major centers like Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and others. I hasten to add, I'm not covering Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai. I'm only covering US, EU, and UK regulation, so that you're quite clear what the coverage is. That will be done in LOIF 1 and LOIF 3. As you might have guessed, because this is a multi-jurisdictional set of transactions, being affected and having effects in a whole number of different jurisdictions, something called the conflict of laws, or what some people call private international law, is utterly important to work out how do we resolve the conflicts as between different law systems. So we're not going to cover the whole of conflict of laws, absolutely not. What we are going to do, however, is to look at the aspects of the conflict of laws under different jurisdictions, starting with the US and the EU, to see how these conflicts can be resolved. So that's the next and perhaps one of the more important aspects of the transactional lawyering that we'll walk through. Now, here's something I want to stress. The teaching and the structure and content of these modules is heavily practice-oriented. The purpose is twofold. The modules at lectures will give you practical knowledge of the legal structure of transactions in the markets. You will walk through the market procedures. How do we do them? How do we affect them? What is the process? Because obviously at each level, each stage of the process, law begins to affect the process. International bond issues, for example, go through a very strict process of how they are done in the markets, and at each stage, the law in different countries begins to affect it, and therefore we will look at that. So the lectures are where we look at, quote unquote, the law and the legal aspects of the transactions. They are every week for both Finance 1, 2, and 3. Finance 2, of course, if it runs. In addition to the lectures, there will be seminars, small group seminars. I hope I can keep it around 20 people per group. The seminars are intended as the method by which you learn practical lawyering in relation to these transactions, which means that I will give you fact patterns to look at, straight out of the kind of thing that one would look at if you were a junior associate with a global law firm. And what we'll do is you will hopefully prepare a written opinion or written advice, or you can draft clauses as necessary, and we sit in a small group of 20 and we'll talk it through. The purpose is to develop your practical advisory skills and drafting skills in the context of practical fact situations. That's terribly important, because what I'd like to see at the end of the year, you walking away with the ability to actually deal with transactions, fact patterns, the way that a first-year lawyer at Linklaters or Clifford Chance can do it. That's essentially, you're getting a pre-training of what I would have done with my associates. That's exactly what I'm trying to do with these seminars. Right. Now, next question is, why am I adopting this? What's it going to, or what use is it to you? Well, it's not going to be of any use to you unless you want to pursue a career somewhere in this world. And there are quite a number of avenues, paths that you can follow. First of all, the obvious one, work with one of the global law firms. Doesn't mean in London or New York, but Singapore, Hong Kong, Frankfurt, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Shanghai, wherever it is you want to go. Because they're doing the same transactions, these global transactions which everybody gets involved in. So that's your first port of call, and I'm hoping that that was one of the reasons you wanted to do these courses. The second, I mean, these are global law firms. Does anybody know what a global law firm is? Hello, anyone there? These are these huge law firms with 3,000 plus lawyers with 35 to 50 officers across the globe. Okay? Largely London-based, largely New York-based, but that's not a fair description because some are conglomerates. Brookhouse Freshfields is an English-German joint operation. It's one single firm, but its origins are German and English. Then you've got the regional law firms. If you want to work with one of those regional law firms, which are located in the regional financial centers like Singapore, like Mumbai, like Shanghai, like Sao Paulo. Any of these places, they've got them. And if you don't want to go and work at Clifford Chance and spend 14 hours a day in there, we can try something else. Go work for one of the regional law firms. That was the second option, especially for those of you who think, I don't want to work in bloody New York or London, it's awful. I want to go and work somewhere nice. Go work in the Cayman Islands. You can go swimming every day at 6 o'clock. It's actually true. A friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, actually ditched his partnership here and took a job with Maples and Calder in the Caymans. Only reason, he just wanted to go home at 6 o'clock and go swimming and surfing. Anyway, be that as it may. The third avenue are the legal directorates in the global investment banks and global banks. Whether you're talking JP Morgan or Deutsche, they all have massive legal departments, 300-400 lawyers at the minimum. So that's another avenue that you can think about if you want to go into this world. Needless to say, the next one alongside, which is quite similar, are the legal divisions of global corporations like Air France or Hyundai or ExxonMobil. They too have huge numbers of lawyers working in this field because they're the ones, these are the corporations which are actually engaged in these transactions. Then there's another set of institutions which are what one might call supranational, like the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They are owned by countries and they provide financing to particular chosen countries in their region, but they are engaged in the international capital markets, the global markets, because they need to raise finance for their activities. And therefore, they too have armies of lawyers working in this kind of world. So that's roughly the broad picture of where you want to go. But I wanted to stress this at this stage. these things don't interest you, and you really want to work in something which involves truth, justice, and the American way, human rights in Syria or whatever it is, this is not the course for you. I'm being serious. I mean, I think people say, oh, why are we discussing this or that? I'm saying, sorry, it's not it for us. So, think about it, and I think you need to think about it very carefully, because if you are going down this route, then you need, and here's a piece of advice I give people every year, you need to think about choice of your modules rather carefully. Don't do a scattergun approach. Yeah, I'll take human rights. Yep, I'll take competition law. Yeah, I'll take war and peace, or what's it called? War studies or whatever. And international finance. Hey guys, it's a waste of time. Focus. You need focus in your, because on your resume, which will ultimately decide your career, you will need to show organization and focus in where you want to go. So you want to go do human rights, please don't do international finance. Okay. Anyway, right, so that's broadly it. I just want to give you a feel for these markets, okay? Just a feel for the markets. The size, I mean, you don't really understand how massive these markets are. That's just the foreign exchange transactions market. What that's up there on the board is the daily transactions volume, not monthly, not annual, the daily transactions volume. 2,426 billion daily. And the reason I thought I mentioned this, I was watching a movie the other day. I watch movies a lot. And in there, they alleged that the Russians were trying to manipulate the exchange rate for the dollar by selling a few $100 million worth of euros against dollars. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. 200 million is not even a drop in the ocean when you look at those figures. That's how big it is. So that's just the starting point. This is the currency trading market, including derivatives. Then you got syndicated loans and international bonds. That's essentially where a lot of the work of the global law firms is concentrated. And you can see it, how big they are. 4,500 billion, not million, dollars worth of transactions in syndicated loans. I haven't got the 2017 figures. And in bonds is 21,706 billion, not million. That's how big it is, and that's the figures that I've got from the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements. I know I'm not doing project finance this year. Hopefully we'll have it. But at the moment, please operate on the basis of it's not there as yet, okay? But that gives you a rough idea of the kind of financing that's involved in international financing projects. They're absolutely massive, mind-boggling numbers. And I think you'll see many of the countries from which all you guys are from, somewhere on that list. And then I take you on to the next set of stats, derivatives markets. This is, again, something that people don't really understand. How many of you, by the way, watched Margot Robbie giving you a lecture? The Big Short? Okay. If you haven't watched it, watch it. And then go watch Margin Call, okay, before you come back to the next lecture. The reason I mention that is derivatives are what those movies were about. Now, the derivatives markets are themselves quite... Hey, guys, can I give you just a request? I don't mind you guys talking, but you will disturb your neighbor. And even if you don't want to listen and you want to do Facebook, please do, but please don't disturb your neighbor, okay? So, we're talking about numbers that are up there. For global derivatives, it's $492,000 billion a year. Lawyers do these transactions every day. There are teams of lawyers in every major global bank which do nothing but derivatives. If you want to just compare the GDP of the entire United States is $19,485 billion for this 2017. And compare that with the global derivatives market, you'll see it. And the capitalization of the NYSE is 16,000 billion compared to what you're looking up there. It's one of the reasons why I think when we get into the courses, you'll find that there is a huge move on the part of legislators and regulators to control this market. because it is so vast. It can and did cause the problems of 2008, which cost the EU $700 billion to rectify, and the US an equal figure of $700 billion to rectify. So it is, excuse me, a huge market, and therefore will be regulated in a way that makes sense for everybody. I don't want to get into more statistics. Just to give you a further feel for what this market is about. Who's involved here? And we're looking basically at the global investment banks, which I mentioned earlier. Well, what do they do? Exactly. And what do we as lawyers do? But the global investment banks actually structure the transactions, i.e. financial structuring. That's their job. They've all got PhDs in rocket science. And they structure these transactions through algorithms. That's not what we do. When they've done their algorithms, and X equals Y equals MC squared, then we come into the picture and try to sort it out. And on a legal basis, it makes sense to everybody on the roadside. Alongside global corporations which actually provide the funding and, of course, obtain the funding. Sovereign states, multilateral institutions, which I mentioned earlier. Just again, picture. Who's involved here? Who are these banks I'm talking about? There's a list of the leading banks. And just so that you know how things are changing, the 3 largest banks on the globe are now from where? Take a guess? China. So things are changing. It's no longer Citicorp and Morgan Stanley. Anyway, we'll come to all of that when you start thinking about jobs. The global law firms I've been talking about, who the heck are they? Well, there's a rough idea of who they are. There's a group in London and a group in New York. I hesitate to call them anything other than London-based firms or New York-based firms because that's what they are. They're not any particular, belonging to any particular country. But that'll give you a rough feel for who am I talking about when I say global law firms. They structure the transactions on a legal basis. That's them. That's who they are. Oh, there's more. Another list for those. Anybody from Tokyo? Japan? No? Not this year. Okay. Singapore, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, they're everywhere. Canada, the Cayman Islands, that's where my friend went to surf. Turkey, Spain, everywhere else. Now I'm going to walk you through the various different modules. What am I going to cover in each module? Finance 1. That's the centerpiece of all the international financial law modules. It's a full year 40 credit module. There are lectures and seminars, as I said, on a weekly basis. It covers major forms of the transactions that I'm going to show you what they are in a minute. It can be done either on its own or in conjunction with Finance 2 and or 3, if Finance 2 is running. What we will cover in Finance 1, and this is just Finance 1. I'm going to start with an introduction to financial markets. Today, I hope. I'm going to get on to international syndicated loans, which is the first major transaction, followed by international bonds, the second major transactions, MTNs, medium-term note programs next, global deposit receipts, and then, sorry, get on to regulatory laws of the US, the EU, in relation to global market transactions. But alongside, as I mentioned to you, I will be looking at the conflict of laws which apply because these are multi-jurisdictional transactions. That will be covered in Finance 1. Okay. Finance 2, I don't, as I said, I don't know whether it's beyond, but the entire module, it's a half module, will mostly be on international project financing. International Finance 3, again, half semester, 20 credit module. It's divided halfway between derivatives on the one side and securitizations on the other, 50-50% in relation to the division of the course. Okay, now I need to tell you what these modules don't cover, so you're not confused. First of all, it doesn't cover banking. I know it kind of sounds, what the hell? I thought this is a finance course, it's something with banking. Afraid not. Banking law is a different ballgame, different world. Those of you who want to do banking law, this is not the course for you. That's straight banking law, which covers domestic financial transactions, bonds, borrowings, loans in domestic markets. And in particular, it will cover the banker-customer relationship. We don't. It will also not involve looking at internal banking regulation, which I think, again, the banking law course covers, regulation of banks within jurisdiction, whether in the UK, the EU, or wherever. Not doing that. Next, we don't get involved in domestic corporate law in the UK or anywhere else. There are courses which actually cover that on the LLM program. I mentioned regulation of global market transactions under EU, US, and UK law and other law systems. But please remember, this is not a securities law course. We only look at regulation insofar as the regulations affect the way we do the transaction, the way we as lawyers structure the transaction. That's all. What the powers of the SEC are in New York, or what the powers of the EU regulators are, who cares? Well, I shouldn't say who cares. We do care, but it's not something we're going to get involved in. We're not going to spend our lives taking out injunctions against the SEC and the EU regulators. As my investment banking friends tell me, we're in it just for the money. That's it. So we're not going to get involved in litigation against the regulators. The other thing we don't cover are international banking and finance in relation to international trading transactions. I'm sure some of you are probably taking Professor Seidoff's course on international trade and shipping and all that. And in the context of that, there are banking instruments used to finance international trade and shipping. All of that stuff will be covered in those other courses. It's not part of international finance, it's part of international trading and shipping. So we're not going to be covering that either. Just so that we're all clear. I think I explained this to you about how we divide up the lectures and the seminars. In lectures, I will explain to you how the transactions are affected by the laws and what laws affect the transactions we're looking at. Seminars will develop the client advisory skills in small groups. And I would expect, hopefully, that you'll get enthusiastic about it and start writing some legal advice, starting with the first set of seminars that we do. By the way, the seminars, I'm hoping that once the registration period is over and we've got a list of those who are doing this module, then we will set up the seminar groups. I'm not going to do it at random. It's going to be done in a slightly more intelligent way, because what I really don't want to see is all the German lawyers in one group, all the Chinese lawyers in another group, and all the... No. I think the whole purpose, look around you. You're not going to have this opportunity again. Lawyers from every jurisdiction sitting in this class. What I want to do at the seminars is mix the jurisdictions. So you can hear how a Chinese lawyer approaches it as compared with the Brazilian lawyer, as compared with the German lawyer or a Japanese lawyer. It's a fascinating exercise, and it's not academic, believe me. Because in real life, we learned it on the job. Because lawyers from different jurisdictions approach things differently. Everybody doesn't approach it the way a New York lawyer, a London lawyer, or a German lawyer, or someone approaches it. It is different, and you've got the perfect opportunity. Anyway, okay, moving on. Who else teaches on this? Oh, okay, sorry, it's me who's teaching. Yep. Did you guys look up who the hell everybody is, by the way? I said go look it up. No, of course you didn't. Okay. So I'll just give you what's on the web page about me. Okay? So you can now read it just in case you think, who is this guy? He doesn't look like George Clooney, so who the hell is he? So there's my background. Just very quickly run through it so you know that I know actually what I'm talking about. My practice is essentially what I'm teaching. There's nothing I'm going to teach which I haven't actually practiced as a partner. And that's why the course is structured the way it is. What else? Well, all the other bits that are on the bio page. Why did you guys look at these things? How do you know who's teaching you? Anyway, okay, so that's what's on the web pages. Going back to who else is teaching. There's people who taught last year, and I hope they'll be teaching again this year. They're all partners from global law firms. You can recognize the names: Allen & Overy, Linklaters, Sullivan's, Clifford Chance, and others. The guarantee I give every year: every person who stands at this rostrum to teach you will be a global law firm partner or someone who has been a global law firm partner. There will be no PhD students teaching you at any time, not even the seminars. So that's the teaching that's going to be done. Okay, moving on. Sorry, I'm going backwards and forwards. Okay, exams. All 3 sets of exams, all 4 sets of exams are take home. You can refer up what you want, look up what you want, and write as if you were sitting in a law firm. That's the whole purpose of the exercise. I mean, I always said, why on earth do we have exams where you can't actually look at anything other than your notes or whatever you're allowed to take to the exam hall? Because if you are in a real life situation, Morgan Stanley asks you a question, you don't shut yourself in one room and try to write an answer. No, of course not. It's not how you do it in real life. So what I've done is to say, just do it from anywhere you want, as long as you don't plagiarize. That's the one thing that that the college requires you not to do. And the other thing, exams department asked me to remind you guys is that take home does not mean doing a Facebook group. Okay. But anyway, so what I'm trying to do is to make you think about things the way that junior associates in global law firms would need to think and write about. There will be no theory questions in any of the exams, none. They'll all be fact patterns on which you will write advice or draft clauses, but no theory questions like regulations of the global financial markets is futile kind of question. No, not interested. You want to do that? I don't know what course you will do actually if you're interested in that, but no, not here. Now then there's something called the practice project, which is a 40 credit project which you can do in lieu of a dissertation. Again, it can only be taken by those taking LOIF 1, 2, and 3. Maybe this year it'll be LOIF 1 and 3, but certainly you can't take it unless you do the other finance modules. And you've got to submit a written paper on the fact pattern, which I will give you somewhere in April, which you will be, again, write the answer from Rio. Who's from Brazil, by the way? Anybody from Brazil? Okay, so you know what Copacabana is. You can write the answer to the project, give the advice, draft the clauses, wherever. And as long as you submit it by 1st of September 2019, and please don't get friendly with the Clifford Chance partner and then get him or her to do the answer, okay? That's the only qualification. The LOIF seminars will train you to do exactly this, to actually write the kind of paper that the practice project is requiring you to do. FAQs. I get asked these questions every year, so I thought I'll just put it all together. Do I need a background in economics? Absolutely not. I still haven't got it. I know nothing about it. Do I need a background in finance? Absolutely not. It's a disadvantage to know it. Because you know what happens? You start talking finance to Goldman Sachs PhDs, and they look at you and think, which planet did this idiot come from? So stay with the law, nothing else. Okay, so you're not required to do any kind of finance or banking and have a finance or banking background. The same goes for accountancy and mathematics. Good Lord, no. It's one reason we all become lawyers, right? We can't add. Company law. Should you have a excuse me, background in it? No, but it will help. Because when I start talking about simple concepts like balance sheet. I hope you know what a balance sheet is, that's all. But you don't need to know a whole lot of company law because we're not looking at any one jurisdiction. It's Japan, it's Kazakhstan, it's Brazil, it's Germany, it's everywhere. And you can't know the company laws of every country on the planet, so no. Next question. Is there a lot of case law in this set of modules? Answer, no. I was going to say none, but there is a few. But once you got over that, there is no case law analysis, which is usually in most English law schools, American law schools, you spend half your life reading long cases and you come out thinking, oh God, why couldn't this Justice Kavanaugh shut up? Just shut up and cut it short. No, they don't. They don't. 80 pages. So, no, unfortunately for all of you, no case law. Few cases which you can, which we will talk about, but they will only be necessary so that you don't make a mistake when you're structuring a transaction. That's all. Not for you to read cases and work out whether the dissenting judgment in 1842 is comparable with and is consistent with the majority judgment of the court in 1999. I mean, no. How many failures were there in the exams? Few. I find that staggeringly. I mean, all you guys have what I would call, in American terminology, a magna cum laude, or in English terminology, an upper second. So how can you fail an exam? It's impossible. Unless you spent the entire 9 months in a nightclub somewhere. Otherwise, you can't fail. But I mean, a couple of guys failed last year. I thought, what? How did you manage this? It really takes some doing. But they did. By the way, and if you fail, I shouldn't tell you this. You've got another chance to do it again in August. But I hope you don't. Last one. Do you promise to get us a job at Clifford Chance after these modules? No. But, there's a but to this. I mean, I know that many of you every year work very hard, are really impressive at writing your analyses, at giving you advice, of drafting clauses. And if you are interested, that group of people, if they are interested, yes, I'll try and help, okay? That's as far as I can go. Can't guarantee anything. Moving on. Oh, hang on. What happened? Okay. Here's another one that comes up every year. Can I get copies of all the slides? Can I get the documentation? No. You know why? Well, the slides have got mistakes for a start. And what is more, I am told that these lectures are now lecture captured, which means apparently, not that I can do it, you can actually see the slides on your lecture capture, which means you can, what do you do with them? Do a, what is it called, a screenshot or something? Yep. Because I noticed a couple of years ago, everybody is taking photographs. I thought, what a collection of slides they're going to have. I know that you take photographs as there's sushi on your plate, sushi or barbecues. Now, international financial law slides. I mean, but now I notice that people are not taking photographs, and that means it's the lecture capture. So anyway, there it is. That's not what you're going to get. Documentation, there is absolutely no point in giving you a syndicated loan agreement document because by the time I give it to you, it'll be outdated. So what I do in the way of approaching this problem is first of all to give you clauses, not a document, but clauses in relation to what is used in the markets, discuss with you whether this clause works the way it should, can it be improved, what do you see as the problem with it, how does it work, that approach, rather than give you a huge wodge of documents and say, go read it. So, having said that, there are, however, market standard documents which we will use. And in particular, those who are doing LOIF3, there's a whole pile of documents which are promulgated by the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, ISDA, which we will use and will go through in class. For loans, I will walk you through the London Market Association's master agreement with the caveat that it is really a fallback agreement. It's not something that Linklaters would use. It's not something that Deutsche Bank or Morgan Stanley would use. It's just a fallback if you haven't got something that has been tailor-made and drafted for you. But yes, it's a good start. It's a good starting point. Okay, last one. Do I give you guys model answers to the fact patterns I give you? No. Because you're trying to develop skills to think as an associate in a global law firm. Copying down model answers isn't going to get you there. When Morgan Stanley rings you up one morning in a year's time, there is no model answer that you can say, oh yeah, here it is, I'll send it to you. No, you've got to do the thinking and you've got to do the answering and the advice. And that's hopefully what we're going to do at seminars, to develop that skill rather than just collect a pile of model answers. Right. What I want to do next is I mentioned the various transactions that I'm hoping to cover at these module lectures. What I thought I'll do now is to give you a taster, a flavor of what they are. So you know when I say international bonds, what the heck are they? A basic working understanding of what it is. So when you decide to register for the module and say, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to look at during the semesters that I'll be working with it. So the first one, okay, that's the list again. But the first one is international syndicated loans, which I will cover in detail. Excuse me, for much of this, excuse me. These are loans which are made to single borrowers, usually, where a syndicate of banks ranging from 40 to 200 plus get together and make loans in, usually, not always, in a whole number of different currencies. So you will have US, German, Japanese, British, Dutch, Australian, Chinese banks all lending to a single borrower in the markets. Importantly, and here's why this becomes a little bit more interesting, they're lending a whole range of different currencies. They're called multi-currency syndicated loans. So you've got this group of banks lending dollars, euros, yen, Swiss francs to this borrower, with the ability of the borrower to borrow in all these currencies. Now, interestingly, a US bank, part of the syndicate, could be lending euro. An English bank would be lending dollars. A Japanese bank could be lending euros, not the currency that they have in their pockets. That creates a whole new structure that's necessary to enable these banks to do what they are proposing to do. We'll talk about how does it happen, what are the legal mechanisms that enable this to be done. Now, we talked about different currencies being made available, loaned in other words, to a single borrower. I said US banks lending euros, Japanese banks lending US dollars. Where the heck are they getting this stuff from? Because they don't have it in their pockets. The answer is there's a vast pool of deposits in various different currencies in a place, an electronic marketplace called the London Interbank Market. And that's where they get their funding from in order to on-lend them to borrowers in the markets. That's why this structure that's on that diagram. So there's the borrower up here, which could be a corporate or a country. And you've got the banks, the syndicate of banks in this rectangular box, lending to that borrower in different currencies. There are the currencies. The currencies being obtained from this vast pool of deposits contained in this thing called the interbank market, which I'll explain when we do syndicated loans. Okay, so that's the broad methodology of a syndicated loan, but here's two things that makes it all rather difficult. Not only are they lending in different currencies, which is not their own, all these funds are being loaned for 30 years, 40 years, and the like, and even more importantly, without any security at all, unsecured. Now that's why this whole thing comes outside normal banking law, because in banking law, no bank goes around making loans without taking a mortgage on your house, your car, your dog, and everything else. In these markets, no. And here's something you need to understand, come to grips with on day one and work with it during the module. The reason is because the borrowers are major multinational corporations. You don't go and tell a corporation like Mitsubishi, I'd like to take some security, please. You'll be shown the door without a cup of tea, because that would be insulting. These are all global corporations who do not give security, but when they raise finance, they expect it to come unsecured. The result is an extremely complex legal document to control the way the loan is handled, the loan is serviced in terms of interest and principal repayments, and so on and so forth. So that's what we'd look at in relation to syndicated loans. International bond issue, another method of raising finance. But this time, the global corporation or the sovereign state which wants to raise the finance, instead of borrowing the funds, will go to an investment bank, one of the global investment banks, a Morgan Stanley or a Deutsche or whoever, and require them to raise the finance that they need, usually in hundreds of millions and probably more likely in billions of dollars, by the sale of securities called international bonds, denominated in the relevant currency, into the hands of investors. That's the skill, that's the task of the investment banks. They will sell the bonds into the hands of investors, just like a share issue in one sense, get the funds and transfer them back to the entity requiring the financing. That's, in its simplest form, that's what happens. Now, the skill of the investment banks is to, first of all, to find the investment institutions who will buy the international bonds. Because whether an institution wants to buy will depend on who's the issuer of the bond, what's the currency of the bond, what's the maturity length of the bond, what's the interest rate payable on the bond, and so many other factors. Global investment banks get paid their commissions for being able to pitch it just right. It's not our job. That's what Goldman Sachs does, and that's why they get paid 4 times as much as partners in global law firms. So who are these investors? They are essentially central banks, they are insurance companies, they are pension funds, they are fund managers, and the like. And that's essentially how an international bond works. Driven by global investment banks, sold to investors worldwide. And I want to explain something in a minute about how bond issues worked in the past so you understand what this is about and how this works and why the whole thing becomes multi-jurisdictional from a legal perspective. Because there you are, a Japanese corporation coming to London, for example, issuing euro-denominated bonds sold into the US, sold into Brazil, sold into Kazakhstan, sold into Singapore by a group of investment banks who happen to be anybody from Deutsche Bank to Japan's Mizuho. That raises a whole number of legal questions which, again, we will look at as part of understanding these structures. So that's international bonds. There's a variation on the theme. They're called medium-term note programs, MTNs, which I will come to. But just to add something, why are investment banks paid so much money? Because when ExxonMobil says, I need $1.5 billion in the next 3 weeks, can you do it? And the answer is yes. In the legal documentation, Morgan Stanley or Deutsche Bank will give a written affirmation, a contractually binding affirmation, that either at the end of 3 weeks we'll get you your $1.5 billion by selling your bonds across the globe, or if we fail, partially or wholly, we, Morgan Stanley, excuse me, will buy the bond, excuse me, will buy the bonds ourselves and give you the money. That is the obligation for which investment banks get paid a huge sum of money, because they guarantee to the borrower, we'll get you the money by selling your bonds. So that's international bonds. Next, I mentioned global depository receipts. Oh, I got time. Tell me when you're bored or tired and think, God, what is he talking about? It's true. I mean, I think I said this to you last time as well. I mean, my attention span at most lectures was 20 minutes, and after that I used to think, what's for dinner tonight? But, so you want a break, just tell me, okay? Global depository receipts, a method of raising finance again, but this time via a rather complex share issue. The issuer issues shares just like any other share issue, but this time they don't sell it to investors directly. And I'm going to tell you in a minute why. They issue the shares to a single, what is called a depository bank, and the depository bank will issue things called global depository receipts to investors. Now there are all these other bits and pieces like DTC, Euroclear, Citadel, who the hell are they? They are clearing systems which match and clear the trades in relation to these securities. But let me come back. Why are they doing this? Why shouldn't the issuer simply sell the shares directly into the hands of investors? Well, a number of reasons. One, international investors like dollar-denominated or euro-denominated or yen-denominated assets. If it's an Egyptian corporation, a Kazakh corporation, investors are reluctant to buy in that currency, any investment in that currency. What the GDR structure does is enable the conversion of, shall we say, Turkish shares. Who's from Turkey here? Anybody? It's okay, I'm not going to ask you a question, You're a Turkish corporation. Instead of having the Turkish lira denominated asset, there's nothing wrong with the Turkish lira, investors are a bit reluctant. Consequently, the issuer of the Turkish shares issues it to a depository bank, located, shall we say, in New York. Right? That bank will then issue on the back of the shares deposited with it an equal number of things called global depository receipts, or GDRs, which are not denominated in Turkish lira but are denominated in US dollars. Investors buy the GDRs. Now, that's the first advantage. Second, assuming you were issuing Turkish lira shares, or Egyptian shares, or Indian shares, where do those shares, once they're sold to investors, how can you sell and buy them? Answer: local clearance systems have to match the trades, settle the trades, and so on. Problem: they take a long time. International investors expect, when they do a trade today, for everything to be settled tomorrow, T+1. Anybody from Mumbai? How long does it take in Mumbai for a settlement of a share trade? I don't think it's T+1. It's a heck of a lot longer than that. And the same is true of places like Egypt, places like Turkey. It takes roughly anything from a week to 10 days, which means capital is tied up for quite a length of time. This system enables the security to be converted into a dollar or euro denominated security, which is then traded and settled through the international clearance systems whose names are up there: Euroclear, Clearstream, Depository Trust Company of New York, and the like, enabling investors to buy those shares through buying global depository receipts. The third reason why they do this peculiar structure is that in many countries, and I go back to Mumbai again, there are restrictions on foreign ownership of the share capital of a local company beyond a certain point, 5%, 6%, whatever the number is. You can't have more than that. That law is, I don't like using the word circumvented, but can be got over, because the shares, when they're issued, are sold to a local bank. All of it. The local bank will then issue these global depository receipts to international investors. So what the investors have At law, it's not a share, but a GDR, which gives rights to shares, which means the local law is satisfied, no complaints. So there's a whole number of reasons why we've developed this structure, and it's used, heavily used, in quote-unquote emerging markets. Commonly in places from South Korea to Egypt to Kazakhstan to places of emerging markets. Oddly enough, the first GDR issue goes way back, 20-odd years, by a British company, British American Tobacco, entering the US market, but that's history. Right. Don't worry about the detail if you missed it all. We're going to go through it in detail during the module. But this is just to give you a flavor. Project finance, since I'm not doing it, shall I skip this? Or do you want to know it in case it comes on stream? Essentially, what happens in project finance is a very simple concept. Corporate entities. Let's take oil explorers, oil producers, for example. You got oil producers wanting to explore oil in, take a guess, Algeria. Take an example. 5, 6 global giant corporations want to explore for oil. What's the cost? Rough estimate, 8 billion. Now, they can easily go to the syndicated loans market and borrow the 8 billion if they wanted to. But no, they don't want to do it because that means 8 billion risk on their books. So what do? They try to break the risk in relation to the 8 billion they're going to sink into Algerian oil wells. How do they do it? Well, they set up, as you will notice, a special purpose vehicle company, this one here, which will borrow funds from banks in different ways. The special purpose vehicle company, which is the actual borrower, the technical legal borrower, is owned by the corporations which are hoping to engage in the Algerian oil project. Now you might say, well, hang on a minute, don't they become subsidiaries and get into trouble again on that front? No, you don't. You ensure that every sponsor corporation, whether it's ExxonMobil or whether it is Norsk Hydro or whoever it is, doesn't take an interest in the special purpose vehicle company share capital, which requires it to be consolidated on the balance sheet of the oil explorer. So it's freestanding. No investor looking at your balance sheet will know you're involved in an 8 billion project in Algeria. The loans are made to the special purpose vehicle company. The banks, therefore, have no access legally to the ExxonMobils and others who are actually engaged in the project. They have only access to the special purpose vehicle company. Now, banks also don't like the idea of getting involved in a project like this directly. So sometimes what happens, quite usually, is that they set up another vehicle company, the bank lending vehicle, the BLV. So you have 2 special purpose corporations dealing with each other in relation to the project. Now, at this point, you start thinking about how the hell is 8 billion going to be repaid if all the problems that can arise in relation to an oil project materializes. To deal with that, we as lawyers come up with all sorts of wonderful constructions, legally, I mean, not oil pipelines. And it is those that constitute the 700-800 pages of lawyering that becomes a project finance documentation. How it's structured, what we do is what I usually cover in project finance, and I hope that we can have it ready for you for next semester. But I'm sorry, at the moment, my answer is I can't do it. So that's where it stands for the moment, okay? Loan sales by, I'll leave that aside. This is LOIF 3 now, asset securitization. What are we doing in asset securitization? Now you watched The Big Short, you'd have come across this. What people do with asset securitizations is as follows. If any corporate entity, anywhere, has got a revenue stream coming from its activities, for example, take a bank. It makes loans. It could be a small bank in Arkansas lending to borrowers on the back of loans to buy their houses to people. That creates a revenue stream that the borrowers, the mortgage borrowers, have to pay the small bank in Arkansas, or in this country, a bank called Northern Rock, which is an actual case. Now, if it stops there, we got no problem. If the borrowers don't repay because they have no money or because the property market for houses crashes and they can't repay, the little banks go bust, which is what happened way back in 1991. The first market crash in relation to housing loans. They all crashed and everybody said, oh, that's a shame, and went back to doing what they were doing. But something happened, and that's why I said have a look at The Big Short. What the global investment banks did was they said, hang on a minute, if you're Northern Rock and you're making loans to people to invest in buying their homes, you can do 100 times more business than you're doing now if you take these loans that you've made, which are assets. A loan is an asset in the hands of a bank. You sell it to a special purpose vehicle company, which buys those loans from you. How? By issuing bonds on the back of those loans, which are assets. In other words, the bonds are issued secured on the mortgage assets. Investors will buy them. So as someone put it, a high street transaction became a Wall Street transaction, because these housing loans were converted into what are known as securitizations, transferred to a special purpose vehicle company. The loan assets were then secured for the benefit of investors who were investing in bonds issued by the special purpose vehicle company. And hopefully, everybody got paid back. Unfortunately, that is exactly what didn't happen, and that's why we had 2008. Because not only did we talk about mortgages for houses, it was also done in relation to, that's residential mortgages, also done in relation to loans. Banks which were lending money, everybody who was lending money realized that you could raise more money by taking the loans you've made to companies, corporations, which are assets, transferring those assets to a special purpose vehicle company, issuing bonds, i.e. the special purpose vehicle company issues bonds secured on the back of the assets, the loan assets, investors buy, and then the bank which has sold its loans, its loan assets, can make more loans, make more money. That was what's known as a CLO, a loan obligation securitization. Now these things all were the flavor of the month in the 1990s and the 2000s, or called noughties. But something went wrong, and maybe I'll just deal with, I was going to talk about it in the context of a financial crash, but just to explain this to you, or should I leave that for later? No, I'll talk about it now. What happened in this scenario? Why the 2008 crash happened? Was that the corporates or the borrowers in mortgages began defaulting. Reason why did they start defaulting? Well, because economic conditions got worse. They couldn't repay the loans, obvious reasons. Interest rates went up, they didn't have the money to pay on the loans. When that happened, the assets held by the special purpose vehicle company became less valuable and sometimes valueless. What happened next? The bonds which were issued into the hands of investors, global investors, also became valueless and defaulted. Billions and billions of dollars of bonds defaulted. That's how the mortgage crash, the failure of small borrowers in Arkansas to repay their mortgage loans, resulted in a Wall Street crash. Because the bonds became valueless, which were based on the loan asset, the mortgage asset, which had been transferred to a special purpose vehicle company, and on the back of which bonds were issued. So, there it is. It got multiplied, magnified by one other instrument, which I'm going to get onto next, which is right here. It's called a credit default swap in this yellow rectangular box. Now, if you were an investor, say you were Lehman Brothers, take an example, who'd bought a massive amount of bonds which were issued in the markets on the back of mortgages, on the security of mortgages held by a special purpose vehicle company whose bonds you bought. Well, you're not going to sit on it and think, yeah, everything will be fine. No, of course not. You'll think, what happens if this starts going bad? Answer, you do something about it. What is it you do? You buy something called a credit default swap from somebody like AIG, the massive German insurer. Now, how does a credit default swap work? I'm going to just take you on to derivatives now, because that ties in with what's happening here. In a credit default swap, a buyer of a bond could be a pension fund, it could be a hedge fund, it could be an investment bank, it could be ExxonMobil, it could be anybody who's worried about whether this bond is going to become valueless or fall in value, goes and buys something called a credit default swap. From whom? From an investment bank, of course. Investment bank promises in the credit default swap documentation that if the bond defaults and it becomes valueless or becomes only 20% of face value, the investment bank will make good, make whole the loss suffered by the buyer of the credit default swap and, of course, the buyer of the bond which has defaulted. So let's go back to our diagram. There. You're Lehman Brothers. You bought $8 billion worth of securitized mortgage bonds. What do? You go to your pals down the road, Goldman Sachs or AIG, and say, hi guys, can you sell us a credit default swap, please? Obviously not for $8 billion, but $2 billion, $1 billion, whatever. So that if these bonds default, you'll pay me. And they said, sure, pay us a premium and we'll give you the protection. And they did. So can you see how the entire market was inextricably caught up with each other? And when the guy in Arkansas failed to pay his housing mortgage, the loans made to it defaulted because they didn't pay the loans to a small bank which had transferred that loan to a special purpose vehicle company. The loan assets in the special purpose vehicle company became valueless. Result, the bonds became valueless. Result, Lehman Brothers and everybody else who had bought these bonds were sitting on worthless assets. What did they do? Well, it was easy. They turned around and said, hang on, we bought some credit default swaps from AIG. They're going to pay us the loss that we've suffered. So they turned to AIG. As you know, AIG nearly went into bankruptcy, insolvency. And that's how the whole set of dominoes crashed in 2008, one after the other. Because the entire market, from the guy who had got a mortgage in Arkansas on his or her little home, or their home, was tied in all the way to $10 billion deals through securitizations. And when it crashed, the whole edifice crashed, the bonds became valueless, and worse still, it then had this knock-on effect due to credit default swaps, which then brought in entities like AIG, who had essentially guaranteed that the bonds would not fail. And so there we have it. I'm going to go through these derivatives in LOIF 3. I'm going to add one more thing about derivatives. In terms of jobs, this is the area of the market which has got the largest demand for junior lawyers. I'm not saying you'll get a job because you know derivatives, no, but it is something to remember when you're doing your modules. So in LOIF 3, I'm going to go through a whole range of derivatives, including these credit default swaps which I've been talking about up to now. and a whole range of other things like commodity swaps, which are used in relation to fluctuations in commodities from oil to anything else. If you're Air France and you're buying billions of dollars of oil annually, you're worried about the price going up. What are you going to do about it? Because oil is supposed to rise above the $100 a barrel mark very soon. Hi guys. Share with us your question. Share with us your question. Seriously. Got a question? Ask. By the way, that goes for everybody. Got a question? Ask, okay? You can interrupt the lecture at any time, just raise your hand. This is your Anglo-American English style of lectures, okay? You're not thrown out of the class for even whispering in class. Just, if you've got a question, just ask. Yeah, please. Why couldn't they pay it? Because the number of credit default swaps that they had undertaken liability for was so massive. Exactly. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, that's why I said the markets were so intertwined. I mean, I had on the previous diagram, if you look, Lehman Brothers, Royal Bank of Scotland, and Bear Stearns, all of whom went bust. Right? Now, the other thing is, they went bust not just because they ended up holding worthless bonds, but because they themselves had written credit default swaps. So you had, for example, Bear Stearns writing credit default swaps to Lehman Brothers in relation to bonds they had bought. So this is a sort of everybody marries everybody else market. And when one went down, everybody went down. Yeah, sorry, you want to ask a question as well?
I didn't have any question.
Oh, okay.
I was just discussing
That's fine.
the model selection.
Fine, whatever. Okay. So that's derivatives, and what I'm going to do on derivatives in Finance 3 is essentially to talk you through these various product structures, then to look at global market standard documentation under ISDA documentation, and take you through how those documents operate in relation to different types of product categories, okay? Securitizations, I will walk you through these structures just like if we go through project finance, we'll go through the structures, how they're set up, why they're set up like this, what is the documentation, what are the legal issues, what are the legal gaps that have to be worried about and controlled. Excuse me. My throat is slowly going. Right, moving on. Anybody else have any comments, questions? You're welcome to raise your hand and comment if you like. Anything you want to ask, say? Okay. So, I'm just going to now get on to what I call the fundamentals of the law. I'm not going to talk law today, okay? So don't worry about it. We're still doing background checks. I've been talking about the law of international finance. I think one of the questions that you'd want to ask, any lawyer would ask, is, well, where do I find this law? Where is it? Well, the straight answer is there is actually no single treaty or group of treaties or group of conventions which deal with the law. Why? Because they are the transactions are multi-jurisdictional, and therefore the law applicable to any one transaction will differ from the last. And that's why we have 3,000 lawyer firms being paid vast salaries to be able to structure these properly. So it involves a mix of a whole number of laws in different jurisdictions, and that means you also need to be thinking about how the conflicts of laws rules apply in relation to the different law systems which actually affect a transaction. And equally, one has to look at the regulatory laws in different jurisdictions in order to work out the law that applies to any given international financial transaction. But as I said earlier, there is, however, a legal regime, a basic legal regime, created by standard documentation created by the global law firms. And that's really what, when we talk about the law of international finance, that's what we mean. it's a collection of the different law systems which are affecting a transaction, the different regulatory laws which affect a transaction, and the standard documentation, how it works in relation to a particular kind of transaction, which is really what we will explore. I stress once again that this is a single integrated market. I'll draw your attention to this concept as we go along, but just try and pick that in your head, because I think what is important, and you shouldn't think of it as a collection, an aggregate of different markets, German market, Japanese market, and so on. And it is important from a legal perspective. We'll discover that as we walk along through the thing. And now we're talking about this, what is an international financial transaction or global market transaction? I just want to draw your focus to three different types of transactions which are found in the various markets. There are those which economists, bankers, and others call domestic market transactions. There are those which they call foreign transactions in domestic markets, and the third category are the so-called global market transactions. And I think it's useful to understand it's not law, it's actually something you need to be comfortable with in looking at the law. In domestic market transactions, what you do have, let me take a simple example. You have a Japanese borrower borrowing yen in the Japanese market. Or, if you want to look at a bond issue, you'll have a Japanese issuer of bonds issuing Japanese bonds to Japanese investors. Those are called domestic transactions because the currency of the issue, the location of the issue, the issuer, the investors are all in one country. That's not the subject of these modules. You then have something called a foreign market transaction. I'm going to walk you through that next. These are transactions in that same Japanese market we're talking about as an example, but this time with one change. The person borrowing yen from Japanese banks in Japan is not a Japanese corporation, it happens to be an Italian corporation. We call that a foreign transaction in a domestic market. In the same way that, if you look at the bond markets, you have in the Japanese market, someone comes to issue Japanese yen-denominated bonds sold into the hands of Japanese investors. The issue of the bonds happens to be Italian. That's a foreign transaction. But it is still regarded as a domestic transaction. By the way, they've got some very colorful names for these types of transactions. So this one, what I'm just describing to you, Japanese bonds sold to Japanese investors denominated in yen. Issuer is foreign, Italian issuer. They're called samurai bonds. If this happened in the UK, they call them bulldog bonds. But these are still not international market, global market transactions. These are domestic market transactions with a foreign element. Now, those of you who are familiar or have even had any interest in any kind of financial history will know that this sort of thing went on for the last 200 years. There's nothing new. When Argentina wanted to build its railways, it came to Germany or to the UK in the good old days and borrowed sterling in the UK and Deutschmarks in Germany. There was not an international market transaction. It's simply a foreign transaction in the domestic market. What makes this thing transform is this. You have, let's take the bond example. You have an issuer of bonds. Doesn't matter where they come from. Japan, Kazakhstan, wherever. Issuing bonds in a location, example, London or New York, in a currency which need not be the currency of the location. In fact, most of the transactions in London are nothing to do with sterling. They're usually dollars or euros. Now what's happening here? If you think about it, a different currency from the currency of the location is being used. Where are they being sold? In our previous example, everything was sold to Japanese investors, or if they were loans, Japanese banks were lending those loans. Here, in these markets, the investors are global. So you have an Italian issuer coming to London or a Japanese issuer coming to London, borrowing or issuing bonds denominated in US dollars, sold to investors in Hong Kong, in Sao Paulo, Kazakhstan, or wherever it is people want to invest. That's the nature of the global market transaction, that the investors are found globally and worldwide, not in a single market. The currencies that are involved in the transaction need not be the currency of the location. And the funding for the transaction isn't coming from the location of the transaction. If you think about it, why did people go to Japan 70 years ago to borrow yen? Because it had a very rich country, 70, how many years ago, before the war, rich country where you could borrow funding. Why did they go to Germany? Because a rich country from which you could borrow funding. But the funding came from that country and that country alone. Deutschmarks were borrowed from German banks. Investors in Deutschmark bonds were German. So you're looking at a country, lack of a better term, with a capital surplus. And this went on right up to the 1960s. For example, Italian and German issuers of bonds, where did they go? They went to the US, the obvious market, the largest capital market on the planet at the time. Why? Because they would access American investors, US investors, to buy dollar-denominated bonds for transactions in Japan or in Italy or wherever. And then something happened, and that's what I'm going to talk about very briefly. Decoupling of the source of the funding from the location of funding. Just think about it. You're borrowing yen, you're borrowing Canadian dollars in London. Where's the money coming from? It ain't coming from the UK. It's coming from everywhere. All that's happening is that investment bankers sitting in London are pooling those funding together in order to structure a transaction. This old structure is completely gone. And it is important to understand this, because this is what we call the global markets, where the investors are everywhere, the currencies which are being used have nothing to do with the location of the funding. And even more, I'm sorry, it's getting bad. Excuse me. The currencies which are being used for the funding are different currencies, not one. And therefore, investors come from every corner of the globe. And it is the development of that market, and I rough estimate on this, last 45 years or so, that has given rise to what you are looking at today as the global financial markets. It's new. The structures are new. And a lot of the lawyering has been done. But remember that these markets are such that every day there's innovation, and every day something new has got to be done by lawyers. But the market that we're talking about, the basics of the market, have now been put in place. It's there even after the crash. And I just want you to work through, and I want to talk to you about the legal, financial, and tax factors which fueled the growth of this market. Because I think it is important to understand what this market is if you're hoping to work as a lawyer in these markets. You cannot operate as if you were sitting Japanese bond issue to Japanese investors in the Japanese market. That's not what we're looking at here. And I'm going to just, any questions so far? Otherwise I can always come back next week with this stuff, but I'd rather get through this. Yeah, if you're bored too much, let me know. Yeah.
If we just look on one transaction,
Yep.
what is the crucial factor that actually defines it as a global one? Is it the currency or the investor that is not
Both.
associated with the
Both. At one time, investment bankers used to say, and economists used to say, the definition of a global market transaction was where the location of the transaction was different from the currency of that location. It was easy if you're looking at yen in New York or dollars in London. Then you got to euro. 27 countries, all sharing the same currency. So the definition took a bit of massaging to get that one right. Because if you ask the question, what is the location of the euro? Well, take quick. But that's the essence of it, that you're looking at the use of a currency which has little to do with the capital market of that country. Because in the old days, if you want to put it in economic terms, you went to a country which had deep pockets, and you could borrow the money from the Americans in dollars or yen from the Japanese. Not anymore. You don't care where it comes from, because the investment banks are everywhere, sucking in the funds that are necessary for the financing from every corner of the globe, from pension funds in Uruguay to hedge funds in Singapore to government funds in Kuwait, you name it. So the investment is coming from everywhere. The currencies that are being used are every major global currency. And as you might have guessed by now, the next big thing that's going to hit the markets is the renminbi. Because at the moment it's dominated by the US dollar and the euro, followed by the yen. But that little triumvirate is about to end. Because once the Chinese government cuts the strings on the renminbi and makes it available globally, it will be probably alongside the US dollar and euro the biggest currency on the market. So you'll be able to borrow renminbi sitting in Milan. And that's the wonderful thing that this market actually has achieved in terms of global finance. And yes, everybody say, oh, look at what they did in 2008, blah, 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 blah. But hey, people make mistakes. What I want to do in the next 25 minutes, if you can handle the thinking, is just to walk you through how we got here. And I'm going to just make one question. What the heck are the markets doing in London? This is a small country at the edge of the European Union. We're going to be falling off the cliff very soon. So why are the markets here? What happened? They should be in the one place that they should be, New York. Largest capital market on the planet, with all the most powerful investment banks on the globe. So what is the market doing here? Well, and I think you just need to understand some factors, because many of these are still operational, because they're a combination of tax law, they're a combination of financial regulations, and so on. So just to give you a broad brush understanding of this. How did this happen? Okay? And we go back a long way, just after the end of the Second World War, and something called the Marshall Plan, where the United States was pouring in US dollars into Europe to rebuild Europe. These dollars were used for construction projects and the like, but the dollars were put in the hands of European banks and British banks. Nobody called them anything else other than US dollars. But in later years, economists started referring to them as euro dollars, because they were dollars located on deposit in Europe, thus euro dollars. And the growth of something called the euro dollar pool, i.e. the growth of these US dollar deposits in Europe, because of a whole number of factors. Factor one was the US government pumping in billions of dollars under the Marshall Plan to reconstruct Europe. That's stage one. Stage two was something the US government did. It was involved in freezing of the deposits, the dollar deposits, of first the Czech government in 1948, with the result that thereafter most East Bloc countries, as they were then called, never held their dollars in New York. All dollar deposits of the East Bloc were held in London, not in New York. The next event that also caused a similar movement was the Suez Crisis. Long, long ago, the Suez Crisis involved, you might have read it in the newspapers recently, the last hurrah of the two imperial powers, France and Britain, trying to impose their will on Egypt, resulting in the biggest humiliation in a long time. But what is more important is the United States imposed a freeze on the dollar deposits of the Egyptian government. They didn't send troops, they just supported the British and the French by this dollar freeze, i.e. they froze the deposits of the Egyptian government held in New York. Guess what happened? Every Middle Eastern country moved their dollars out of New York and never held them there ever again because of the freeze. Didn't matter in 1956. But when OPEC was formed in 1974 and the petro-billions started pouring in, they didn't pour into New York. They poured in over here. So there was the growth of this thing called euro dollars, or dollars in Europe, by around the mid-60s. But by then something else had happened. Before right through this century, not this century, then the 20th century, sterling, the Deutschmark, the French franc, and other currencies were used to finance railways in Argentina or ports in China. After the war, other countries stopped allowing the use of their currencies to finance any overseas projects. Sterling was the exception. It continued to be available for use for international financing until 1957, when the Bank of England, by a regulation, said sterling can no longer be used for any financial transaction outside the United Kingdom. That caused a huge, wouldn't understand how it affected people. But then it meant that people had to look for ways of finding substitute financing. Well, answer one, go to the US, borrow dollars. Expensive. Answer two, some clever investment banker said, hang on a minute, we don't need to go to the US and incur the costs. What about this euro-dollar pool that's floating around Europe? Dollars, US dollars, honest Uncle Sam's dollars, on deposit in Europe. We can use that to finance transactions. And that was the first time they started using US dollars outside the US to finance non-US transactions, starting of the whole use of dollars outside the US. That was helped by two sets of regulations in the US, Regulation D and Regulation Q. Reg D was probably more important. The Regulation D, which by the way is still in force, required, and does still require, United States banks, US banks, to place on deposit with the Federal Reserve a certain percentage of every deposit they received. The deposit which they took from ExxonMobil, for example, Bank of America takes a deposit from ExxonMobil, they had to place X percent, let's say 5%, with the Federal Reserve Bank interest-free. What's the impact of that? Even us lawyers can understand it. It pushes up the borrowing cost. Why? Let's look at it this way. Let's say BOA receives $100 from ExxonMobil in Los Angeles. Obviously, it's got to pay some interest for the deposit. So let's say it pays 3% interest on the $100 to Exxon. Okay? Now, if BOA wants to make money, it needs to lend the 100 to somebody else. Charge them more than the 3% they're paying ExxonMobil. Let's say they can lend the 100 to Petrobras in Brazil at 4%. Its interest is 4, so they made a profit of 1. Great. Problem, you can't lend the full $100. You've got to put 5% on deposit with the Federal Reserve interest-free because of Regulation D. Therefore, it's only got, shall we say, if it's 10%, for example, that has to be placed with the Federal Reserve. BOA has now got only $90 to lend to Petrobras. Now, it doesn't take a PhD in mathematics to work out that in order to make the interest of $4, you need to charge more than 4% because you can't lend 100, you can only lend 90. Exact rate, by the way, is 4.44, but that's a kind of calculation I need a calculator to do it. With the result that the interest rate chargeable by BOA to Petrobras is higher. because of this requirement of the deposit to be held with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, Regulation D did not apply to deposits held outside the United States. So guess what? The entire euro-dollar pool, which at that time was small, a few $billion dollars, could be loaned by a US bank sitting in London without putting anything on reserve with the Federal Reserve, which means, in our example, it could do what they wanted to do in the first place. It pays Exxon 3%, lends 100 to Petrobras at 4%, which means that essentially it was lending at a rate lower than it could have done sitting in New York. Now guess what happens now? There's a shift in the lending center of dollars out of New York. So that was Regulation D. Now, curiously, Regulation D type regulations became applicable through the years to every other major currency at the time. Canadian dollars, French francs, Deutschmarks, yen. But once again, didn't apply to Deutschmarks outside Germany, French francs outside France, Canadian dollars outside Canada. With the result, you can see what happens as a shift of currency out of the jurisdiction. And that's the growth of not just the euro-dollar pool, but something called a euro currency pool. This meant that bankers sitting in London or Frankfurt could use these dollars, these Deutschmarks and French francs, to make loans, and they did. The syndicated loans market saw its birth somewhere in the late 60s and 70s using these very dollar and currency pools sitting outside their home countries. So that was the first movement out of dollars, out of their home countries, use in what was then called international finance in syndicated loans, so it could be made to a Japanese borrower wanting Deutschmarks. Much more easily than sitting in Germany and doing it. Then came the international bond markets, which saw a similar kind of movement out of the US again. Like I said, if you want to borrow dollars by issuing bonds, well, you go to the biggest global market on the planet in those days, the US dollar capital market. You issued bonds, raised finance. But the US legislators were very unhappy about it because dollars were flowing out of the US because of foreign borrowing. It caused what economists called a balance of payments deficit. Don't ask me what the heck it is, but they calculate these things and say, that's bad. So they were running a balance of payments deficit, and President Kennedy, the famous President Kennedy, decided to impose something called the interest equalization tax. And most bankers and economists who write on this will tell you that the birth of the international bond markets and the global markets as we now know it can be dated straight back to 1964 and John F. Kennedy's interest equalization tax. How did it work? He proposed and effected a tax on every non-US issuer. I picked Fiat because Fiat was always being hit with this tax in America. If they issued US dollar bonds in the US markets, President Kennedy and the legislation in the US required the issuer of bonds to pay a punitive tax rate calculated on the differential between the interest paid by Fiat in Italy and the interest they were paying in the US. And to take an example, if Fiat was paying 3% on US dollar bonds in the US and they had to pay 20% for lira bonds in Italy, Kennedy said, okay, you will pay a percentage of the difference between the interest you pay in Italy and the interest you pay in the US. So 17 minus 3, and you'll pay us a quarter of that, which is quite a massive amount of money. So guess what? And I picked Italy because the very first recorded international issue, at least that's what economists say today, was done by an Italian corporation, Autostrada, which said, like hell am I going to the US to pay these amounts? And some clever investment banker said, forget the US, we've got a solution for you. That is, issue the bonds in London, out of London, into the hands of investors everywhere who've got euro dollars. So the dollar holders, whether they were funds, insurance companies, pension funds, bought Autostrada's US dollar denominated bonds without going anywhere near New York. When that loophole opened, you can imagine what happened. It just became a floodgate, opening of the floodgates. The Autostrada issue was just the first, and the entire bond markets over the next 10 years just moved out of New York. But there were other factors, and I think this is something that we still come across, and I might just mention them to you. US securities laws. For a bond issue, you need to comply with the whole range of United States securities laws. German and Japanese corporations in particular didn't want to comply with them. Reason? They required 5 years of accounts of German and Japanese corporations, or any other corporation, to be restated in accordance with US accounting principles, which is a massive cost. They had to comply with SEC regulations, the like of which nobody saw in Europe at the time, with the result that the giant German and Japanese corporations in the 70s and 80s issued all their bonds out of London rather than out of New York. It was cheaper as well, and of course, it was lighter regulation than that existed in the US. Something else happened. The movement of the giant US, Japanese, and other investment banks to London. Because once the market started growing, investment banks, especially from Japan and the US, said, hey guys, want a piece of the action. Let's get over that. Set up offices here to operate their investment banking operations, and you found Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Lehman, Merrill, Nomura, Daiwa, excuse me, issuing bonds on behalf of clients out of London rather than out of the US. Thus, the growth of a huge investment banking community in London rather than in New York. There was another factor. US commercial banks, even then, were prohibited from engaging in investment banking activities because of something called the Glass-Steagall Act, which was repealed and now reintroduced in a different form. But let's not go into that for the moment. The Glass-Steagall Act prevented US commercial banks, JP Morgan, Bankers Trust, Citicorp, and others from engaging in investment banking, including, of course, selling bonds to the markets. However, Glass-Steagall didn't apply here in London. Guess what happened to every US commercial bank and every commercial bank in Japan, which also had similar regulations? They all set up their global investment banking operations in London without having to comply with either law in New York or law in Japan. So, JP Morgan's global investment banking headquarters was set up here in London in the 80s, which is an amazing movement of capital and expertise because of the Glass-Steagall Act. With the result, everybody started moving across, and then a whole number of other things that happened. There was the growth of the global law firms to service these clients who had moved over here. There was the mega privatizations that occurred in the UK during the 1980s, which are running into billions of dollars. British Airways, British Petroleum, British Telecom, they were all privatized, the first mega privatization. And they were all done by these investment banks which had moved to London. That spurred the growth of global law firms. And if you want to know when did they grow, by 1990 they had grown. That's 20 odd years ago. Global law firms had reached the kinds of levels, at least of a 1,500 lawyer level, not the 3,500 they've got now. And there was also the question of light regulation, which I'll come to again when we look at the various modules going on about regulation in London. The other thing that happened was the opening of the purchase of all UK banks and financial institutions to anybody who wanted to buy them. No restrictions on national ownership. That was called the Big Bang. It was 1986, and there onwards, just about every UK bank, UK investment bank was eaten up. Because they could be bought by the Americans, they were bought by the Japanese, but the result was a concentration of investment banking expertise here in London. There were lots of other things that happened that resulted in the movement of markets here. 2002, there was something called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Anybody heard of it? No, okay, forget it. We'll come to it later. But the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was a result of the collapse of Enron and WorldCom. Anybody ever heard of Enron and WorldCom? Yeah, okay. Sarbanes-Oxley was a US legislation in consequence of Enron and WorldCom, which required massive levels of disclosure if you were trying to do any kind of bond issue, share issue, and so on, which, once again, some countries and their giant corporations said, no deal, not doing it. We're not going to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley. And two countries which were at the forefront of this, China and India, major global giants who refused to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley. No Sarbanes-Oxley in London, so here we are. Okay, I'll talk about this next week. I think you're looking absolutely knackered. And I'm going to get on to the actual law next week, okay? This is just all by way of background. Now, what I'd like to, hang on, guys, give me a second. If you want reading lists, it's on Keats. Do any of you guys look at Keats? Yay, okay, good. The reading lists are on Keats. I wouldn't want you to go and dish out on buying all sorts of books. Just take it easy for the moment. Follow the lectures and ask questions in class. Make whatever notes you want. And if you want to buy a book after a few weeks, please do. But I would suggest you first get to grips with the subject as we go along. Excuse me. Seminars will not start. I think I put this on Keats as well. Seminars are not going to start until the registration period is complete. And we've got the final list, and we've got the ability to put the seminar groups together. And I'll put the seminar groups on Keats within a couple of weeks, so you'll know which one is which, okay? Anything else? Any questions, please ask, and then we gotta go. Yeah, please do. Should we read something for the next lecture? I'll tell you what, you want to read, I mean, I think a bit of background reading would be good. Not law. Leave the law to one side. Okay? Just do some background reading. I'll tell you what, here's something fun you can read. Michael Lewis, Liar's Poker. And Michael Lewis, The Big Short. I mean, I'm serious. It gives you a really good feel for what's going on in the market. I know it's not relevant to you as a lawyer, but at least you know the context in which you're operating. But law books, not yet. Yeah. Sorry, guys. Can you give your colleague a chance, please? Yes, absolutely. We're covering credit derivatives, commodity derivatives, equity derivatives. Yeah. Is that your particular interest? Equity derivatives? Okay, good. By the way, if you guys, I know this is going to happen over and over again. So if many of you have got questions on what module should you be thinking about, if you want to go to Clifford Chance, let me know. I'm happy to sit down after class and talk about it, okay? Done. We will see you next week. Hi. I got to switch it off. I don't know how.